Well, hello and welcome to the latest installment in our ongoing series, PPE in a Time of Pandemic. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Stephanie Collins of the Australian Catholic University. And we're going to talk about collective action, collective responsibility in the pandemic. Now, without further ado, let's get started. So the first question is this. In a recent online piece at The Conversation entitled, "Are you complicit in deaths if you don't stay home? How to do good during the virus lockdown?" Stephanie, you argue that failing to adhere to public health guidelines during a pandemic might make an individual person a morally culpable contributor to the deaths of others. So you draw on an analogy to joining 1,000 other people in pushing a boulder off a cliff that will crush a crowd situated below. So I was wondering if you could just say more about this analogy, about how ignoring social distance guidelines is analogous to joining a group effort to push such a boulder.
So I wrote that piece in March last year, and I think if I had written it now, I would have instead talked about letting a boulder fall down a hill rather than pushing a boulder. So then the thought would go something like this. The basic idea would be this. So imagine you're kind of relaxing on the side of a hill, like living your life, as many of us were in March last year, and you see a large boulder rolling down the hill towards a crowd of people at the bottom of the hill. Now, the large boulder represents coronavirus, right, kind of barreling through our lives. The people at the bottom represent kind of high-risk people, so people who would need kind of intense hospital treatment if they caught the virus. As we know, right, you let coronavirus roll down the hill, so it hits all the high-risk people, and we end up with kind of overwhelmed healthcare systems. Now, then the thought experiment, so I'm interested in collective action, right? So in the thought experiment, you imagine, right, you can't stop the boulder on your own. You've got some things that you can put in its path. You've got a picnic basket or whatever you can put in its path. That's not going to be enough to stop it. But if you and everyone around you kind of pile up things in front of the boulder, you can all stop it together. I take it in the boulder case, we kind of imagine, like, if everyone on the hill kind of acted to put things in the path of the boulder, they took on some cost, right? They lose some possessions, right? If everyone did that, then the boulder would be stopped. The people at the bottom wouldn't be smashed by the boulder. That's what they ought to do. And so very simply, I just drew this analogy saying, look, there's no morally relevant difference between taking on cost to contribute towards stopping this boulder and taking on cost in the form of wearing masks and abiding by social distancing guidelines to stop coronavirus from kind of causing overwhelmed healthcare systems. That was the very simple idea, was just that there's no morally relevant difference. And so you're kind of as blameworthy in the coronavirus case as you would be in the boulder case if you just sat to the side and didn't do anything to try and stop the boulder.
Just following up on that, you as you just said, in the boulder example, it seems pretty clear that by sitting on the sidelines and not helping prevent the boulder from going across, the individual has done wrong. Even though, let's suppose that, in the case where you're pushing the boulder, maybe the push wasn't causally necessary for the boulder to move, or maybe your help wouldn't be sufficient to prevent the boulder. Still, we think it seems like you've done something morally wrong. But as you also say in that piece, there's considerable disagreements over the exact nature of the wrongdoing in this case. So I was curious, what are some of the different accounts of wrongdoing that might apply here? And which of these accounts do you think is the most promising?
The term that often gets used for this is to say the harm could be overdetermined, right? So it might be that it's kind of more than enough people sitting by the sidelines doing nothing, that you trying to do anything kind of won't make a difference. That's one possibility. Or kind of on the flip side, maybe your action is superfluous. So there's so many people piling up things in front of the boulder that there's no point in you taking on cost to do so. Of course, in the coronavirus case, it's more likely that we're in the first situation, that we're in the situation where not enough people are doing anything to stop the boulder falling down the hill. At least in certain countries in the world, like Brazil and so on these days. Okay, so then if the boulder's going to kind of roll down the hill anyway, not enough people are doing their part, how do we account for the fact that I've done anything wrong? Because the boulder would have fallen down the hill no matter what I did. So yeah, different philosophers have different views on this. So Derek Parfit argued that an individual action can be wrong simply in virtue of being one of a group of acts that together create a bad outcome. Of course, then it's very hard. We have to try and draw lines around what the relevant group of acts is. That's a really tricky question of how to answer that. Shelley Kagan has argued that an individual does wrong if there's kind of some chance that your action will be necessary for causing the harm. Of course, there are some cases where you know in advance that there's no chance that your action is going to be necessary for causing the harm. I'll give one more example. So Julia Nevsky has recently argued that you can be morally responsible, blameworthy for helping to cause harm, where helping, as she argues, doesn't require that you're kind of a necessary condition for the harm resulting. The account that I prefer, that I like, is the Ness account. So it's kind of a complicated kind of condition, but it says that you do wrong if your action is a necessary element of a sufficient set of actions for causing harm. So explain this in the Boulder case. So in the Boulder case, right, you piling up your belongings into the path of the boulder might kind of not be sufficient for stopping the boulder and might not be necessary for stopping the boulder. But if we take everybody's kind of actions of piling up stuff in front of the boulder, there'll be some subset of those actions such that your piling up action is the difference maker to the boulder being stopped. So maybe we need 7 of us to pile up our stuff in front of the boulder so that the boulder stops. As it happens, 10 of us act. You might think there's no point in me acting because it's superfluous. Okay, but if only 6 of us had acted, then I would have been necessary. So that's the kind of example to demonstrate this idea of being a necessary element of a sufficient set. So the sufficient set is 10 people, and your necessary element, insofar as there's some subset that if that subset had acted, you would have been necessary for the outcome. It's a bit complicated, but that's my preferred view. Just because I think it allows us to draw the proper lines around the group that did harm, around the group that's blameworthy, I think.
Kind of along similar lines, in that same piece, you argue that even if a society is successful in flattening the curve, I guess in the boulder analogy, even if enough other people were to pile a sufficient amount of their stuff in front of the boulder to prevent it from going off the cliff, an individual can do wrong by free riding on the efforts of others and failing to adhere to public health guidelines. So I was wondering if you could just explain, what is it to free ride and why is it wrong to free ride in this case?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the free rider very simply is just someone who makes an exception of themselves and sits by and lets everyone else do the work so that the good outcome is achieved. So the free rider kind of gets the benefits of other people's contributions without taking on any cost themselves. I think, so you can go quite specific here and into particular moral theories. You can say that the free rider kind of acts in a way that's not universalizable in Kantian terms. So, right, they act on a maxim that they can't will that everyone else would act on a reason that they can't will everyone else would act on. But I actually think there's a more general sense in which the free rider does wrong. So if you think about the project of least political morality, so the project of figuring out what morals we're going to hold each other accountable to in the public sphere, you can think of the free rider as kind of just refusing to engage in the project of abiding by, of trying to engage with others in a way that kind of treats everyone as equal. So when it comes to moral theory, right, some people, you kind of think, oh, Kantianism, so the view that says you should act as you can will that everyone else would act, that's a very particular moral view. I think in the political realm, it's much more intuitive that our laws kind of should be, at least in democratic, if you're a Democrat, if you're someone who believes in democracy, our laws are things that we should all build together and all kind of sign up to together. And so if you're thinking about what we should do in political terms, the free rider is someone who says, everyone else should abide by these rules, but I'm not going to. And that, I think, is kind of to just abdicate kind of the responsibility to engage in the political process of figuring out what rules we should all abide by together. So yeah, so the free rider kind of makes an exception of themselves in that way.
So in discussing the demands of successful social response to the pandemic, you suggest that we need to be more than just individually rational. We also need to be sort of collectively rational. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about what the difference is between the two species of rationality, and why won't like a sufficiently large aggregate of individually rational responses suffice to achieve critical pandemic goals like flattening the curve?
Yeah, great. So this might take a little bit of explaining. So in very general terms, that when someone engages in collective rationality, the person asks, what's the best thing for us to do? And then they do their part in that pattern of actions, which is a pattern across a group of people. When someone engages in individual rationality, they ask, what's the best thing for me to do? And they kind of ask that question while treating any other agents as kind of just fixed features of the environment, to kind of be worked with, to be predicted, or to be maybe to some extent relied upon, but they don't treat us all as kind of if you like one agent, treating us as if we were one agent, acting together. And so the difference here, it's important that this difference is not just the difference between being altruistic and being selfish. So it's not that the collectively rational person is altruistic and the individually rational person is selfish. So a really famous example that gets used to demonstrate this in economics is the high-low problem. So this is the bit that requires a bit of explaining. So imagine there are two boxes. Well, no. So imagine, sorry, no. So you and I are each in two different rooms, right? And we're each presented with two different boxes. You've got your box A and box B. I've got my box A and box B, right? And we both know that we both really love bananas. And we're told, if you both open box A, you'll each get 10 bananas. If you both open box B, you'll each get 5 bananas. But if you open different boxes, so if I open A and you open B, or I open B and you open A, you'll get nothing. Both of you will get nothing. So here it's like, okay, the most important thing is that we pick the same box. But also we want to get as many bananas as possible. So the obvious thing to do is to choose, for both of us to choose box A. And in kind of experimental economics, in the lab, very high rates of people choose box A. It's kind of, obviously it's money, not bananas, right? They choose box A, but the bananas are more fun. Okay, so it seems clear that we should both choose box A in this kind of case, but individual rational choice theory has real trouble explaining that, because what it says is, from my perspective, I should choose A if you choose A, I should choose B if you choose B, and that's all there is to it, because I don't treat you as kind of a person that I'm acting with together. So many people think, and I kind of tend to agree, that in order to account for the kind of the obvious fact that we should pick box A, we need to introduce a different kind of reasoning that we engage in, which is where we think about the pattern of actions that would be best for the two of us to perform, the pattern of actions that would be best kind of across the group, and then do our part in that pattern. And that's what's sometimes called we reasoning. So reasoning kind of as part of a group, as opposed to I reasoning, so reasoning as an individual. And in my book Group Duties from 2019, I argue that we sometimes have moral obligations to engage in we reasoning rather than I reasoning. So thinking about what's the best pattern of actions across the group, rather than what should I do, because the question what should I do sometimes leaves us in these kind of problematic stalemates about what to do. So then you asked about the pandemic, so then applied to the pandemic, the case actually kind of needs to be altered slightly, but suppose I'm very altruistic and I'm thinking about hosting a party for my friends, right, which of course would spread the virus. Normally if I were to throw a party, that would make people really happy because I throw great parties. So in normal times, right, my altruism should lead me to throw a party, and we can suppose in pandemic times, if I threw a party, the effect on the healthcare system wouldn't be that bad. Maybe some of my friends would need a hospital treatment, but by and large, that hospital treatment would be successful for them if they could get it. So if no one else throws a party, maybe it's okay if I throw a party. You're in the same position, right? So you're considering throwing a party. If you're the only one to throw a party, that would be kind of okay. But But if we both throw parties, we can imagine that our local hospital will be overwhelmed, right? So in this kind of case, it seems like for me to throw a party relies on you not throwing a party. So it kind of goes back to this free riding thing of making an exception of yourself. Me throwing a party, yeah, assumes that you won't throw a party. And if we think about this case kind of in individual terms, like with individual rationality, then I should kind of conclude, well, I should throw a party if Ryan doesn't, and I shouldn't throw a party if Ryan does. Okay, fair enough. And maybe I've got some beliefs about whether you'll throw a party. And so in this kind of case, individual rationality can give us answers depending on like what my beliefs are about what you will do. But I think a kind of better and more intuitive way of capturing the kind of reasoning that we should engage in this case, kind of from a moral perspective, is to think kind of what's the best pattern of actions across the group, which is the pattern of actions of neither of us throwing a party. Yeah, it means we take on some cost, we don't get this great party, but it also means that we're not making exceptions of ourselves, we're not kind of relying on other people refraining from these actions in order to perform them ourselves. So that would be how it applies to the pandemic case, kind of thinking about, yeah, again, the best pattern of actions across the group and what's my part in that.
So sort of in the spirit of talking about sort of thinking as a group or thinking as a collective, some people think that in order for there to be like collective obligations, that groups have to have a certain sort of internal structure. So for example, corporations and other highly organized groups, they can have obligations, but like loose gerrymandered combinations of individuals cannot. And so I'm curious, what do you think of this sort of view?
Yeah, so good. So it's very important. So far, I've just been talking about ways in which individuals can reason. I've been talking about, in the collective reasoning case or we reasoning case, I reason as if I was picking for the group or as if we're a group that's acting as one, but it's still reasoning that's going on inside my head and I'm choosing what to do. So I actually agree with these people who think that you need some kind of structure in order to have a group that's an agent with obligations. So I think in the case where you and I are in different rooms, we're not a group agent. We together cannot have an obligation, but I can have an obligation to kind of treat us as if, a moral obligation to treat us as if, to reason as if we were a group. I, though, have a very permissive account of group agency. So I think collections of individuals have to meet some conditions in order to count as a group agent that can have its own obligations. But I think those conditions are pretty weak. So in my view, as long as a collective has a decision-making procedure that can take in moral reasons and respond to those moral reasons, the group per se can have obligations. And now a decision-making procedure, in my view, can be something very, very loose. So an example I give is kind of two friends deciding where to go for lunch. Back in the days where we went to restaurants for lunch, two friends deciding where to go for lunch. They can count as a group agent in my view. Their decision-making procedure is probably conversation-based consensus, right? They use conversation to try and reach a consensus on where to go. That's a procedure that they have for making a decision. That procedure can take in moral reasons because the two individuals can kind of bring up moral reasons within that conversation. So that's going to be enough to make them a group agent. Many other people in the literature think that groups have to meet, well, they give accounts of group agency on which groups meet stricter conditions. For a lot of people in the literature, I think they're trying to give sufficient conditions for group agency rather than the minimally necessary, like minimally sufficient conditions. They're trying to give just some conditions that show that they're a group agents. So I think many people maybe on reflection would agree with me that you can have quite a minimal account of group agency. But in any case, many of the accounts in the literature do provide quite strict conditions. So that's kind of what's a bit different about my account. Yeah.
There are some things that we can only do together. So for example, like playing a duet or maybe storming the Bastille. And some people think that if a group of individuals can do something that those individuals aren't able to do alone, then that group is the kind of thing that can also have duties of its own. And I'm curious what you think about this idea.
Yeah, great. So that's an argument that's very common when people are trying to argue that groups that are not agents, so groups like humanity or the affluent, or a storming mob, when philosophers are trying to argue that such groups can have obligations in their own right, often those philosophers will they'll kind of appeal to something like a can implies ought principle, which is like this group has the ability to do a thing, therefore the group can have an obligation, at least can have an obligation to do that thing, and maybe does have an obligation to do that thing if it's kind of a morally important outcome. I think, I do think that obligation implies ability. I'm less sure that more generally ought implies can, but I do think obligation implies ability. However, I think the kind of ability that you have to have in order to bear an obligation is an ability to make decisions. And in the case of a group like humanity or the affluent, or even a mob, depending on the size and longevity of the mob, you're not going to find the ability to make decisions. And so although they have the ability to produce outcomes like the storming of the Bastille, they have the ability to produce outcomes, they don't have the ability to produce those outcomes via decision making. And I think that's a block on their obligations. The reason for that is just that I think the function of obligations in our practical reasoning and also in our kind of interpersonal interactions is to function as an input to decision making, whether that's first personal decision making about what I will do, second personal decision making about what claims I'm going to make against you, or third personal decision making about what advice I'm going to give someone else. I should say here that although I think you can bear an obligation only if you have the ability to make decisions, I don't think that to bear an obligation you have to have the ability to decide to perform that very obligation. So for example, if I'm standing on the side of the road and my friend's about to be hit by a bus, right, I might just reach out and pull her back from the road without ever having made like a decision to do so, anything that looks like a decision to do so. I think that's fine. I can have that kind of obligation. But I can have that kind of obligation only if I'm the sort of creature that can in general make decisions, only if I in general have decision-making capacities. So I think ability is not enough for obligation. You need the ability to make decisions.
So this next question is about demandingness. So on many traditional pictures, individual moral obligations can be quite demanding. And one worry about positing a rich array of collective obligations, in addition to individual moral constraints, is that, albeit indirectly, this might stand to increase the moral burdens already carried by individuals, and might make moral life especially demanding for those who make sort of disproportionate contributions to organized activities in society. So do you think it's true that with greater sociality comes greater responsibility? And do you think that, can our collective obligations ever be too demanding?
I think they can be too. So I think yes to both. So I think with greater sociality comes greater responsibility. Yes, but also yes, our collective obligations can be too demanding. And I think it's important here to distinguish between kind of how many obligations you have and the total amount of cost that morality demands you to bear. So I think when we are constituents of group agents, which I think all of us are. I think it's basically unavoidable given the kinds of creatures that humans are, the kind of social lives we lead. When we are members of group agents, we get an increased number of obligations, because I argue, again in that 2019 book, that when a group agent has an obligation, each member has an obligation. So being part of a group agent increases the number of obligations that you have, but that's not a reason to think that the total demands that all of your obligations give you, therefore kind of shoots through the roof in any kind of problematic way. So I think there are constraints on the total demandingness of morality, how much morality can demand of us. I mean, at the very least, right, morality can't demand so much of me that I cease to be able to perform moral obligations, right, that I kind of experience burnout or breakdown, or get to the point where I just can't function as an agent. That would be self-defeating from the perspective of morality. So at the very least, you've got that kind of constraint. Arguably, maybe you have more constraints. I haven't thought in depth about this problem, about exactly where the limits of morality's total demands are, but I think you'll get a constraint somewhere, probably in a way that gives us more permissions than the view that says our obligations are constrained by what will allow us to still be moral agents. Anyway, so you'll have constraints on the total cost that you're demanded to bear. That kind of demanding the ceiling, if you like, that morality can't ask you to go above, stays in place even as you get more obligations. So I guess the real trickiness that comes in with greater sociality is having to balance off obligations, having to decide which ones are more important than the others, so which ones you're going to perform, given that you can't perform all of them without over demanding this. That's a problem to which I don't have a solution, but I think that it would be problematic if our moral theory said, oh, we kind of, if we posit group obligations, we get too many obligations and it's really hard to work out which ones are more important, which ones we should prioritize. Therefore, we should just say that we've only got really basic kind of individual obligations. I think that would be kind of giving up too easily. So I think, yeah, it's really tricky to pick which obligations are more important than which other ones, so as to not behave in ways that are over demanding. But I think that's kind of a decision that each individual has to make. It's not a reason to chuck out collective obligations altogether.
This next question is about the effective altruism movement. So you've written a bit about effective altruism, and you argue that the movement faces certain difficulties regarding collective action in particular. And I was wondering if you could just tell us more about that.
Yeah, sure. So this actually goes back to the kind of high-low case that I was discussing earlier, the boxes of bananas, right? Effective altruism, there's many different definitions of it, but one way to understand it is it's the view that if you're going to try and do good in the world, you should try and do as much good as possible. That's the kind of, that's the most, I think, light touch way of putting it. Like, some people think that effective altruism says you must do as much good as possible in the world. I think that faces the kind of over-demandingness problem we were just talking about. So let's say it's, if you're going to do good, you should try and do as much good as possible. Now that kind of characterization of effective altruism is usually couched in terms of individual rationality that I was talking about earlier. So you as an individual should ask, what can I do? What kind of marginal difference can I make? Given what everyone else is doing, where can I do the most good? And I think there are going to be cases where if I'm asking that question just from the perspective of what I should do, from the perspective of individual rationality, I'm going to get a different answer than if I ask, what should we do and what's my part in that? So this often comes up in discussions of effective altruism under the heading of systemic change. So you can kind of, you can give, however much money it is you're going to give to bednet charities, so charities that distribute bed nets to prevent malaria, or what have you. That's maybe one option. Another option is you can do your part in trying to somehow transform the global system such that countries will reliably give bed nets to their citizens, pushing for kind of human rights and democratization and whatever. So, I mean, that's kind of a crude way of putting the binary, but suppose that that's your two options. If you're just looking at the difference that you as an individual can make, maybe the best thing to do is just give money to a charity that will provide some bed nets to people who are at risk of malaria. But if you think about what we should all do together, it might start to look like systemic change is the right thing to do. Now, I'm not ardently pro-systemic change over the bed nets solution, partly because I think it's very unclear what systemic change would look like, what exactly my individual role is or should be in producing systemic change, which is why I kind of hedged when I was characterizing what systemic change is meant to be. I think it is a bit fuzzy exactly what it's meant to look like. So I'm not ardently pro-systemic change, but the point that I make in the paper that so unkindly just named in the chat, so the paper is called Beyond Individualism. It's in a edited edition about effective altruism. The point that I make in that paper is it's worthwhile thinking about the collective rationality question. What should we do and what's my part in that? And considering that kind of alongside the individual rationality options. So the options where I kind of hold fixed what other people will do and just try to make as much difference as I can at the margins. I think it's worth at least asking that question. And I think a lot of people in effective altruism don't ask that question of what we all together should do.
The next question is about emotions. So we sometimes talk as if organizations have, or at least ought to have, emotions. So for example, like, Monsanto should be ashamed of itself, or Marlboro should be more repentant for its role in tobacco-related deaths. I'm curious, what do you think about this sort of talk? Are we just making sort of purely metaphorical gesture when we speak in this way, or can we actually expect certain sorts of effective comportments from corporate entities?
Yeah, great. So I dealt with this in a paper kind of provocatively titled "The Government Should Be Ashamed," paper from 2018. And what I argued there is, so I think a lot of this talk is metaphorical. So if you kind of agree, as many theorists of emotions do, that emotions have both if you like, functional components and felt components. So emotions have this component, which is about how you behave and what you believe and what you prefer. They have that component, and then emotions also have this kind of if you like phenomenology, this feeling of what it is to have the emotion. I think if you think that there are those two components to emotions, then organizations can have the first one. They can have the functional component. They can have the part of emotions that leads them to behave in certain ways, have certain beliefs, have certain preferences. But organizations per se, at least I argued in that paper, organizations per se can't have the phenomenology, the feeling of the emotion. Incidentally, I now actually think that might be wrong. So in a book that I'm working on at the moment called "Organizations as Wrongdoers," I'm actually trying to argue that individuals are the material constituents of organizations. So we should really take organizations seriously as material objects in the world, of which humans are material parts. And then I think if an individual has a feeling of remorse or guilt, if she has that feeling while she's got her organizational hat on, then the organization has that feeling. So we might think here about kind of political apologies. So in Australia, the really famous case is Kevin Rudd's apology for the stolen generation. So Prime Minister, and I think it was 2008, apologized for the government stealing of Indigenous children from their families. That apology had certain behavioral upshots for the government. It implied that the government believed certain things. It implied that the government had certain preferences. So that apology had a certain, what we call, functional profile for vis-a-vis the government's behavior and cognition in the world. So the government's kind of beliefs and preferences. But we also hope, right, that when Kevin Rudd gave this apology, he had certain feelings. He had a real feeling of remorse. He was wearing his Prime Minister hat, if you like. He was acting as the organization. He was acting as a material constituent of the organization. So I now actually argue that when we're playing our role in organizations and we have some emotion that's about a behavior of the organization, and we have that emotion kind of as a member of the organization, that feeling as a member of the organization has that feeling too. And I think there's moral importance to this. So if we think about the political apologies case, right, we care, I think, whether the Prime Minister who's standing up there apologizing on behalf of the nation, whether that person really feels remorse. I think if we found out that Rudd actually, had no feeling of remorse or guilt or regret, we think, there was a failure there on his part, and maybe also even on Australia's part in general. So I think there is value to the felt component of emotions, but I'm now trying to argue that organizations surprisingly can actually have that phenomenology, that feeling, when members have it because of their role. Which most people in the literature, including my earlier self, argued that organizations can only have the functional aspect of emotions. They can't have the felt aspect of emotions. So there's some kind of gap in the value that they can produce in that way.
So you've also written about the ethics of care. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about this ethical approach and what's attractive about it.
Yeah, sure. So ethics of care. So yeah, my first book, so my 2015 book was called The Core of Care Ethics, which is based on my PhD dissertation. And my goal in that book was really to try and figure out what is distinctive about the ethics of care as compared with, say, other moral theories like utilitarianism or deontology or virtue ethics, and what kind of is at the core of that theory. So the way I put it when opening the book is to say, moral theories often have slogans, right? So utilitarians maximize utility, deontologists respect rights and duties, virtue ethicists try and flourish or be a good person. What's the slogan of care ethics? It was a theory that kind of both intrigued and confused me when I was a master's student and early PhD student. And what I end up arguing in the book is that the care ethics slogan is dependency relationships generate responsibilities. So I think the care ethical picture of the world is kind of similar to a contractualist picture, in the following way, that it views morality as arising out of relations between persons. So it's not that there's like the good, as in teleological, like consequentialist theories that we have to try and pursue. And it's not that there are kind of injunctions upon my actions as kind of an agent considered potentially in isolation from others. Rather, morality arises out of connections between people, but for care ethics, those connections are connections of dependency. So what really matters is relations of dependence and interdependence that persons have to one another. And when we are in kind of dependency relations, when I'm dependent on someone, that person gets responsibilities for me. When someone else is dependent on me, I get responsibilities for that person. So that's the kind of basic picture. What I kind of like about it is that I think there's a strong tendency in philosophy, maybe particularly liberal political philosophy, to view humans as kind of independent, autonomous, rational creatures. I know that's a bit of a caricature, of course. Not everyone views us as just that, but I think care ethic kind of provides a nice antidote to that. So it says, yeah, maybe we are that. But also important moral obligations are generated by relationships of dependence. And I actually think that care ethics probably isn't the only correct moral theory. So I don't think care ethics is, or I'm not even sure it tries to be, a theory of the whole of morality, a theory of all of our moral obligations, a theory that says, yeah, we get obligations out of dependency relationships and there's no other moral obligations. I don't think it should be read that way. I think it's rather, here's one way in which we get moral obligations, and it's a way that's kind of not sufficiently appreciated by other mainstream moral theories.
So I'm now going to pass things over to my erstwhile colleagues, Simone Gubler, with some questions from the audience. Thank you so much, Stephanie.
So the first question that we have is actually a bit more of a pushback, and it's from Richard Galvin, and he's a bit worried about the boulder analogy. So he says there might be a significant disanalogy between the boulder cases that you were talking about at the beginning of the discussion and the case of masking or social distancing in the context of the pandemic. So in the boulder case, an individual is causally impotent, they can't stop the rock, and there's a relatively rigid threshold for preventing the rock from producing any harm. And it's not the case that in the context of the pandemic, I might be causally impotent in the same way. I'm not impotent in terms of spreading COVID. If I spread COVID, then I'm irresponsible, even if others are behaving responsibly. I can spread it to others all on my own. So he's suggesting that it's not a collective action problem in quite the same ways as the boulder case, both in terms of the harm or risk imposed and in terms of the way in which one might be causally impotent.
So yes, it's a great question, and it's true. I was talking about the harm as overwhelmed healthcare systems or overwhelmed hospitals. Of course, even that isn't a strict threshold harm, right? They can be more or less overwhelmed. They can be more or less stretched, right? That's kind of there's a graded notion there of overwhelmedness. But I was taking the harm to be overwhelmed healthcare systems rather than just spreading of the virus. So I was focusing on a particular harm that occurs. It's a good point, and I think it's true that coronavirus is kind of what's sometimes called an incremental harm case rather than a threshold harm case. But I think so it is an incremental harm case, but it's also important that there are thresholds involved, and there's this question of what wrong I do vis-a-vis the thresholds, even if there's also the incremental harm. And it's worth noting that when I wrote that like opinion piece, the kind of the group that I was targeting with that argument was people, many of whom at the time, this was March last year, many of whom were kind of in my social circles, who thought, look, I'm young and healthy. Everyone who I know is young and healthy. This thing, it's not going to be that bad for me. I don't really have any interaction with high risk people or older people. So I'm going to spread the virus, but it's not going to be that bad. The people that I'm going to spread it to, it's not going to be that bad for. So I was really targeting people who do accept this point that it's an incremental harm, that there is some harm to spreading the virus, but that that harm, at least what they individually cause through that harm, isn't that bad, or isn't so bad that it's worth the huge cost of working from home and isolating yourself and wearing masks and all the rest of it. So yeah, so good. So yes, there is an incremental aspect to the harm. There's also a threshold aspect, and I think it's worth considering how that works. And then also there's this question of what to do when the incremental harm doesn't kind of motivate people, and that doesn't seem to be bad enough to justify the kinds of impositions that we were being asked to impose on ourselves.
Fantastic, thank you. So the next question is from Parker, and it's about your work on group duties. And Parker's asking, if groups can be derelict with respect to moral duties, can they be blamed as a group, or in particular, can they be punished as a group?
Right, yeah, so thanks. So this, helps me to, again, talk about my new book, which is called Organizations as Wrongdoers, which I'm still working on, and I don't know when it's going to be out, probably in a year or two. Yes, I think they can be blamed as groups. In fact, I have an unpopular view on which blameworthiness and obligation are not symmetrical. So I think that groups that aren't agents cannot bear obligations, but I think they can be blameworthy. I think that groups that are agents can bear obligations and can be blameworthy. So I actually think blameworthiness is, if you like, cheaper than obligations when it comes to the groups that we can target with these things. That's because I think blameworthiness kind of serves the function of expressing, it serves a lot of functions. One function that it serves is a kind of cathartic function for victims. It's important to be able to express blameworthiness. I think it serves the function of demanding that things go differently in the future. And I think if you have a group that's not an agent, you can make the demand things should go differently in the future with regard to that group, where it's the individual members of that group who must act on that demand. So I think, so I think groups can be blameworthy. Punishment is obviously tricky because most punishments that you can visit upon collective agents are going to have costs for members. So even if you think about fines of corporations, that's going to have knock-on effects for shareholders, and maybe also people are going to lose their jobs if the corporation gets fined a lot of money. Unfortunately, though, so my view, and this might be unsatisfying, my view is, that's kind of a moral risk that members bear. So I suppose I'm of the view that just by being a moral agent in the world, we incur some obligations and some costs, and it's not our fault. It's not, we needn't feel bad about that, but it happens. It's kind of if you like, a collateral damage of living socially together with others. So I think, yes, collective agents can be punished. That will sometimes have implications for members that are a bit counterintuitive, or that seem a bit unsatisfactory, or that seem to say that members did wrong when members didn't really do anything wrong. I think it's just a cost of sociality and acting together with others that members have to bear those costs. I think, though, it's important that we are clear in our minds about why members are bearing those costs. So it might be that members didn't do anything wrong. They're bearing that cost kind of just in virtue of membership, without the implication that they as individuals did wrong. So as long as we kind of refrain from targeting those negative attitudes towards members and say, this is just, sorry, it's a cost that you have to bear as a result of your engagement in this group, then I think it takes some of the sting out of the way in which collective punishment distributes to members. Yeah.
Thank you. So the next question is from Andrew Delton, and it's about uncertainty. So he writes, unlike thought experiments or economic games, real world situations are full of uncertainty. What some people think is a public good, others might sincerely believe is not a public good at all. So can the latter group opt out without moral qualms, particularly if a majority or whatever threshold you like does view the potential project as a public good?
So this question, and this is about uncertainty in our teleology, if you like. So this is a question about uncertainty in terms of like what shape the good has. And I suppose this seems to be a question about the extent to which I should defer to others or take others' views into account and trying to work out what is good. I haven't published on this, and I haven't thought too hard about it. So the kinds of cases that I tend to deal with in my writing do tend to be the kinds of cases where it's pretty clear what to be done, or it's pretty clear what the moral good is, and I'm trying to work out how should we reason about those cases. There is definitely an idealizing aspect to that kind of methodology. Yeah, I haven't. It's an important question, and it's a good area for research. It's not. I will say this. I don't think that this problem is at all particular to collective action or group duties or anything like that. I think just when we're deciding what to do in the world, there's this question of how I should act given that other people have different values to me, how much I should defer to them, how much I should trust my own judgment of what kinds of things are good versus somehow taking others' views about what's good into my assessment of what I should do. I think these are just questions for all moral theories, all political theories, and maybe like all theories of rationality or theories of practical reasoning. So I don't think this is a particular problem for theories of collective morality. Where I suppose it might be a problem is where some people claim that there's a group obligation that I don't want to be, that I think it doesn't fall on us as a group. Even there, though, I think that's not different in kind. That's not a problem that's different in kind from a case where someone tells me that I have an individual obligation that I'm not so sure I have. So yeah, I kind of want to kick this question over to other areas of philosophy and say it's not particular to group ethics.
Yeah. Fantastic, thank you. So the next question is from Dimitri Gallo, and it brings together discussion of effective altruism and some of the things you're saying in the context of over-demandingness with respect to group obligations, with respect to the worry that group obligations might pile up. We'll have to decide which ones to honor in cases where we have too many or competing obligations in view. And Dimitri wonders what you think about using effective altruist-like considerations to decide between group obligations when faced with a choice between competing group obligations. So that is, the idea is when you have to choose between group duties, choose the duties where you're most likely to be a difference maker. So what do you think about that suggestion?
I would need to think about it more. I think I don't have any immediate problem with that suggestion. I suppose, yeah, so then the kind of upshot of that might seem to be, at bottom then it's individual rationality that's kind of doing kind of the overriding work, or the kind of fundamental work in telling us what we ought to do. I sort of do want to resist that implication. I think it's gonna, yeah, I think I don't have a problem with that way of reasoning. But I think I would want to say that even if we allow that way of reasoning, that's not going to, and importantly for me, and maybe the question's not meaning to push back on this, but importantly for me, that doesn't mean eliminating the group obligations from the picture altogether, because I think there are going to be cases where we can't explain why the group obligation exists just with reference to the difference that I can make as an individual, even if we can pick between group obligations by appealing to the difference I make as an individual. So I think I would accept that suggestion.
Thank you. So the next question is, I guess, kind of invitation to talk a little bit about one of the distinctive social features of the pandemic, which has been the rise of some really virulent conspiracy theories. So Quinn notes this, right? Quinn writes, one distinctive thing about the experience of the pandemic has been the rise of conspiracy theories. And some people have suggested that part of the attraction of conspiracy theorizing is the opportunity to adopt an especially tight-knit, privileged sort of group identity. And so Quinn wonders whether you have any thoughts about the role of collective agency and group identity in the emergence of conspiracy theory in our present moment.
Yeah, that's another really interesting question that I kind of want to kick over to other areas of philosophy, and in this case, kind of sociology, to be honest. I think there are risks to over-identifying with the group agents in our lives. So although I gave this really strong, this kind of, one might seem kind of metaphysically weird picture before, on which we are parts of the group agents. We have like kind of material parts of group agents, and that might sort of make it sound like our identity kind of gets subsumed by them, or our individual identity gets overridden by them, or something like this. I think it's kind of important not to kind of get sucked into any one particular group agent. And actually, this kind of goes to the previous question about picking between different group agents and how to different group obligations and how to balance them off against one another. So I think there's definitely a potential for a really pernicious role for identifying with group agents in our lives. And I think historically, that's why a lot of philosophers have been really wary of collective responsibility. So before about the 1980s, it was really unpopular to think that there could be collective responsibility or collective obligations. I think one reason being a kind of a general fear of collectivism for all sorts of like political reasons, but another one being this kind of, this idea of like loss of individual, I guess, reasoning or critical, like ability to reason critically as an individual. So I suppose my answer would be, yes, that's a risk. It's important to distinguish between the good that collectives can do for us, the way in which collectives can have, if you like, their own point of view, their own bundle of beliefs and preferences and actions that can result in various good and bad things in the world. We want to distinguish that and our role in that from our kind of identity as humans, or our identity as persons.
So the next question is a fairly specific question about, I guess, your intuitions about the high-low game. It's from Shelley. So Shelley writes, can the high-low game be solved with individual rationality alone? Opening box A and opening box B are, in a sense, tied, at least when I don't have a strong antecedent opinion about what you will do. The fact that opening box A might result in a larger prize makes opening box A salient. It's a tiebreaker. And if I think that that option is salient, you probably would too. So couldn't that make me think that you will opt for opening box A after all, thus making opening box A the uniquely rational response? So Shelley's asking for your thoughts in response to...
Yeah. Great. So this is actually, I think, roughly what Parfit said. so this is getting you in good company here. I think, Parfit said, I think the phrase that he used was, it's the obvious place to meet. It's salient, and that's, there's kind of large literature on these kinds of, it's kind of examples where you ask two people to meet somewhere in New York and they will meet at like Central Station at noon or whatever, because it's like somehow salient. So I think, we could get lucky and be in that kind of world. I think it's difficult to, so why is it that that's salient? I suppose, so it's salient because it gives me the highest individual payoff, and it gets you the highest individual payoff. But at least in the high-low case, and this is different from the New York picking a place to meet case, at least in the high-low case, like the lowest one is also salient insofar as it's another option where we get the lowest reward. So there's the one where we get the highest reward, there's the one where we get the lowest rewards. They're each kind of equally salient. So it doesn't seem like salience is what's doing the work and making the higher one better. It seems like it's the one where if I picked it, I would get the highest reward. That seems to be what makes it important, what makes it kind of stand out, or what makes it seem like the obvious thing, the obvious place to meet, as Tafet says. I think that's not, it doesn't seem to capture, I just think it's not sufficiently explanatory. Why is it? Why is it that I assume that you're going to go for that? Because it's really like I assume it, and you assume that I'm going to go for that. So there's already a built-in, I think there's already a built-in assumption that we make about what the other person is going to do, that with that undergirds the salience. It's not that the salience undergirds the assumption. So the kind of assumption that the other person's going to do it, and the salience of the high as opposed to the low, kind of both arise together. And so I don't think we can appeal to either one to explain the other. And I think in order to explain how both this assumption that the other person's going to do it and the fact that it's the obvious place to meet, in order to explain how they both arise together, I think it's maybe not necessary, but at least makes the most kind of psychological sense of the reasoning that we go through to talk about what's best for the two of us, or what's best for both of us together.
So we've got time for just one more short one, and it's from Ava. And you piqued her interest when you mentioned your new Organizations as Wrongdoers book. And she asks simply, what's it about? So maybe an opportunity to just say a little about that.
Oh, great. Yeah, nice, easy question to end on. Well, kind of easy. Easy insofar as it's not a challenge, difficult insofar as I'm not totally sure what it's on yet. So the goal of the book is it has got a few different goals. So one is to situate organizations as kind of material agents in the world. So this is stuff that I was talking about before, about individuals being material constituents of organizations. So really understanding organizations as like natural objects. A lot of people in the collective responsibility literature think that organizations and corporations and collective agents are like spooky, or ghostly, or kind of strange in some way, and therefore should be eliminated from our ontology. So one goal of the book is to make them non-mysterious agents. And then also a lot of people who work on collective responsibility, they talk about agency, group agency, but they don't talk about the group agent in the world, and what that thing is, where we find it, what it's made up of, right? So that's one goal of the book. But then the goal is to do that, to use that kind of, that metaphysics, which I think I'm going to talk about kind of them as parts of wholes, members being parts of structured wholes, where the whole is the organization. Sort of just like how motorcycles and tables are structured wholes. Then the goal is to use that metaphysics to kind of explain how we can sensibly incorporate organizations into our practices of how we treat wrongdoers. So then talking about things like how they can have self-directed reactive attitudes like regret and remorse, how we can punish them, which is another issue that was brought up. So the goal is to kind of use this metaphysical picture of organizations as kind of concrete agents that are made of humans, to kind of vindicate and justify and to some extent sort of specify the way in which we can treat them as wrongdoers. So focusing in particular on questions of punishment and the distribution of costs to members, and this issue of kind of first personal reactive attitudes like regret and remorse. That's sort of the overall aim of the book, I think.
Well, fantastic. I'm excited to read it. So I'm going to hand things back to Ryan. We've just run out of time.
Thank you so much. So thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking Stephanie Collins. Thank you so much, Stephanie.